Thank you. In order to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives, we all should want a hyper performance, a high performance in the extreme drugs to patients system. Now, the goal of that system should be better drugs sooner at lower cost. And that goal is not being achieved. And that's because the FDA has a monopoly on access to new drugs. And in particular, the FDA continues to demand ever more extensive and expensive, both in time and money, clinical trial data. So the people who bear the ultimate cost from this dysfunctional system are the patients. So I'd like to briefly talk about the patients. On this slide, you'll see 11 pictures of cancer patients who were denied access to a not yet approved drug that their doctors thought had real, genuine potential to either extend their lives or even, in fact, save their lives. Now, the picture in the middle is of Abigail Burroughs. Abigail was the daughter of a very good friend of mine, Frank Burroughs. And she came down with cancer in her neck. Frank tried to get her into one trial and was refused because they said the cancer was in the wrong part of her body. He tried again for a second trial, and then they said she was too sick to enter the clinical trial. So after Abigail died, Frank decided to devote his life to dealing with this issue. So he founded the Abigail Alliance for Better Access to Developmental Drugs. Now, it's been 16 years since Frank started that organization. And oftentimes I hear the supporters of the status quo making the claim that something like free to choose medicine can't work because people and patients are just not smart enough to deal with these types of decisions. Now, in 16 years, the Abigail Alliance has fought for early access to 40 drugs, and they only have just some preliminary type of information. But of those 40 drugs, how many were subsequently approved by the FDA? All 40. So don't accept the argument that we're not smart enough to deal with our needed health treatments. Now, the third edition of the Free to Choose Medicine book is out there. And Vernon Smith, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and partly for his work in deregulating markets, he wrote the foreword or the preface to the book. And he makes a very important point, saying that the Free to Choose Medicine system promotes decentralized responses close to the local knowledge that is available to physicians and their patients, but not to the FDA. This book is fundamentally bipartisan and should be read in that spirit. So the point is that the Free to Choose Medicine principles that we'll briefly discuss is economically sound. It's good stuff, and it's practical. Now, as to practicality, about 10 years ago, an early version of the Free to Choose Medicine was packaged into a booklet, and it was translated into Japanese by Mr. Yu, that's his short nickname, Mr. Yu, at the Japanese for Tax Reform, which is a free market think tank in Japan. And at that time, Mr. Yu indicated to me that he was going to give that booklet to every politician in Japan, including all the top management of the pharmaceutical companies in Japan. And I said, you know, great, have at it. Well, in 2014, Japan passed the equivalent of Free to Choose Medicine for regenerative medicine drugs, think stem cell treatments. And Heartland went back to Mr. Yu, and they've recently put out a policy paper on this, documenting what has happened in Japan and what was involved. And it turns out this thin little booklet actually had a very, very enormous impact over there, because Mr. Yu did what he told me in an email. I did what I said I was going to do. Now this is important because this is a major developed country that has now embraced the principles of free to choose medicine. And by the way, to no surprise, investment capital is flowing to Japan for regenerative medicine drugs. Now, there are three principles to free-to-choose medicine. The first fundamental principle is that it's competition to the FDA's status quo process. That after a drug has passed safety trials and one or more phase 2 trials demonstrating some initial efficacy, then a drug developer could put his drug on a free-to-choose track. Now, we're talking about having access to an innovative drug 5 to 7 years before what might become an official FDA approval. And a very important point is that the free-to-choose track would be operated independently of the FDA. An organization, perhaps the NIH, would be well suited. But since it's competition for the status quo, it needs to be operated independently of the FDA. So now individual patients could express their own preferences for risk, could talk to their doctor about their unique health condition, and then make a voluntary decision. Do they think an approved drug is in their best interest, or a not yet approved free-to-choose medicine drug? Now, we've talked about Japan as a significant demonstration in process of the practicality of free-to-choose medicine. Now, free-to-choose medicine is really common sense. So if it is common sense, outside the US, people should be moving in this direction. And there's a company in the Netherlands, it's called My Tomorrows, and I've met with the CEO, Dr. Ron Bruce. Very, very smart guy. Now, he was CEO of a biotech company that he sold to Johnson & Johnson for $2.5 billion. Smart guy. Now, his father came down with late-stage lung cancer, and as he tells the story, he said, there's a drug that a pharmaceutical company in Europe has that's clearly the best treatment for my father. I'm CEO of a biotech company. I should be able to get that drug for my father, right? Didn't work out that way. All the government bureaucracy involved and what have you. So after that experience, he formed this company, My Tomorrows. What My Tomorrows essentially does, it's a middleman. So if you're outside the US, say you have stage 2 pancreatic cancer, My Tomorrows will provide you the relevant information, just like free-to-choose medicine, so you can make an informed decision. And then My Tomorrows coordinates and handles everything, the paperwork, dealing with the government, handling the drug developer, getting the right dosage, where do you go to get it administered? All of that gets done. This is working. It's actually taking place. Let me read to you a couple of quotes from Ron Bruce as to how he perceives the current situation. There is only one reason why a good drug is expensive: the 15 years taken to develop it. The molecule itself is not expensive. If we continue down the current route, the process will only become more expensive. But if we introduce drugs earlier to the first patient, they will become cheaper and more patients will benefit. Actors who benefit from the current system do not want change, but patients will ultimately win as they are the consumers. Society's growing access to data changes the world, and the pharma industry should not be the exception. Now, the second key principle is a trade-off evaluation drug database, or TED for short. Essentially, you and your doctor could get on the internet, it's an open access database, and all of the relevant information to make a comparison in terms of approved drugs versus not yet approved, free-to-choose track drugs would be there for you to make that call. The note on the slide that patients' genetic data and biomarkers would be part of the data. This is really, really critically important. Because as a drug is in developmental testing, as on the free-to-choose track, more and more patients will take the drug if the drug is giving good treatment results and the side effects are manageable. Now, we'll be able to isolate in real time, okay, in terms of biomarkers and genetic data, subsets of patients who do incredibly well. And that the drug developer his R&D will be facilitated to understand why. So it will be extremely advantageous if you're a patient to find out, are you a member of this subset of patients who is generating incredibly strong results? Now, with the current system, if a drug is in phase 3 and it misses its statistical milestone, but there's a subset of patients who do extraordinarily well, the FDA will say that's hindsight data, and go do another phase 3 clinical trial, raise 50, 100 million, and take 3 to 4 years. So what we're talking about here is just turbocharging innovation with fast learning. And the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, the innovation would accelerate by having access to this data, which would be displayed on TED. Now, the third component is observational approval. So free-to-choose medicine legislation would empower the FDA based on compelling data, observational data, not randomized controlled trial data, from the free-to-choose track, and that they could grant an observational approval. Now, that is a gigantic carrot to a small biotech company that has limited capital but extraordinarily high scientific skill. They can take their drug, and if they prove with free-to-choose results that their drug actually is better than the approved treatment available, then they could get observational approval. That would incentivize insurance companies in particular to reimburse for that drug. And it also would put pressure on the FDA if there's a drug out there that is doing incredibly well, and to get insurance reimbursement, all the FDA has to do is give it a nod and give it observational approval. That's a good deal. Okay, to summarize, the goal is to achieve better drugs sooner at a lower cost. We're talking about choice up, regulatory costs down, innovation up, competition for sure up, and drug prices down. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Got one more slide I got to bring up, and Tim's going to come back up here and, with a few more remarks, and then we can open it up for questions.
Thank you. And the reforms we're proposing, free-to-choose medicine, are substantial. As I noted earlier about before the Bay of Pigs invasion, the current FDA was structured. That's how old the current system is. We probably all agree things have changed a lot in plenty of places. So you wonder, well, how can you make those changes? Is this even possible? A lot of time we come to conferences like this and say, hey, these are some great ideas, let's make some changes. How do we make it happen? And I'd like quickly show you how we believe free to choose medicine can happen and is already in the process of happening. As Mr. Madden has mentioned, based on some efforts of free to choose medicine nearly 10 years ago, free to choose medicine has debuted in Japan. We think the initial results are very promising. And you might ask, well, why did that start in Japan? Obviously, individuals make policy, and the efforts of the Heartland Institute and a one man in Japan trying to promote those changes. It's been implemented and is underway in Japan. But one thing to note about Japan, it's the single oldest society in the world. And regenerative therapies were not happening, and they needed a way to jumpstart innovation. So you have to have that happen, and that's why I believe one reason it did start in Japan, and hopefully the results will. I can see a day. I can certainly see a day they will have the type of regenerative therapies, stem cell treatment for Alzheimer's, which will be available in Japan and not here in America. We're actually starting to see that happen. The second thing. The second round of reforming the FDA, which has already occurred, is right to try. We have mentioned that previously. Signed into law by the President of the United States. I was there at this signing, and I came back and I was visiting with a few interns, or one intern at the Heartland Institute. There's one thing that really struck me that the President said. He said, what took so long? What took so long? Matt Bellina and thousands and others, the Goldwater Institute, Heartland, and dozens of folks trying to make these changes. What took so long? Again, the choice was before right to try that it was more important that Matt Bellina die so the FDA could have their way and wait. So 5 or 6 years, Mr. Bellina, you might find that treatment, or there might be a cure from the FDA, but that doesn't work for you. But the choice was before right to try, you should die if you have a terminal illness. Our thought now is after right to try, and we believe it has some fundamental flaws in terms of incentives for the marketplace, but we can take that kernel of truth. For the first time since 1961, at least with a terminal illness, you were able to access legally drugs. If you can find a company that would give them to you or sell them to you, you can access a drug if you're a terminal illness without the FDA approval. That is huge. That is a massive change. That's one component of free to choose medicine. But there are other rounds before we think we get to that. So we're looking as well as Mr. Madden mentioned, updating the database. Actually, the current commissioner of the FDA, Mr. Gottlieb, you might have heard him speak before at a conference like this. He's actually an intellectual ally that says we need to bring freedom and choice to the marketplace. And so we think there are opportunities working with the FDA, working outside the FDA to provide initial data. Actually, the key words the FDA is using today is observational data. Actually, in Japan, they have observational approval. They'll approve a drug for general use that hasn't been fully approved in Japan with the free-to-choose medicine process they're adopting over there. The fourth round we're looking at is targeting high-profile diseases, whether it be ALS, whether it be a particular type of cancers, or Alzheimer's. And if we can target those are things that the political realm says we've got to do something about. My mom is struggling with one of those diseases. The idea the FDA says, well, you know what? Maybe in 10 years, really, maybe in 10 years we might have a therapy. Maybe even 20 years we might have a cure. And we see those actually in the press regularly. Pharmaceutical companies say, hey, we've got great news. We've got a drug that made it through phase 1. And we're still 7 to 10 years out. And so targeting that politically, I think we have some things to do. We also have a number of federal agencies. I spent 6 years on the VA committee, and there are tremendous problems with the VA and tremendous specific diseases with veterans that they have not found solutions and cures for. And so we're going to be working. We think it's actually possible with Heartland Institute with free to choose medicine actually showing progress by demonstrating to the politicians and to the bureaucrats as well as the industry that actually allowing individuals choice can actually show some solutions. And finally, our ultimate goal is congressional passage of free to choose medicine, which we believe will not help thousands of people, will not help tens of thousands of people. It will help millions of Americans, not those with a terminal illness, but with dozens and dozens of other things and illnesses and those afflictions. We think it's entirely possible, and I look forward to your questions about how we might implement that or thoughts you might have of how we change a system that's been stuck in the same method since 1961. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim to handle questions for Mr. Madden and myself.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's from right there. And I was just going to mention, if you didn't, how when FDA, they've had the same procedures in place since before the Bay of Pigs. So that's quite a long time ago. And did you mention, how long does it take? It's an average 15 years and $2 billion for each drug. Is that right?
It varies. 10 to 15 years and up to $2.5 billion for a breakthrough treatment.
Just think about that for 10 seconds and explains a whole lot about our drug industry in this country. So we'll start with the questions right here. Can you please identify yourself so our people know to whom they're speaking?
Sure. My name is Jennifer, and I think this is absolutely fantastic. As somebody who's helped put medical devices through the 510K process, I know exactly what you're talking about. The one question I have, and I'd just like to know some of your thoughts as having gone through this and actually going through and watching what happened with Theranos. What are some of your thoughts on how we keep charlatans and some big pharma from preying on people who have terminal illnesses? Because we do know that there are people that are out there who can prey on people, who can create data and create drugs that may not have efficacy, but can say they have efficacy and sell people a bill of goods. And sell it for a very high price. So how do we prevent that type of thing from happening?
I didn't get into the details of the free-to-choose medicine bill, but what it would require for a drug developer to get on the free-to-choose track is that there'd be an advisory committee, probably managed by the NIH. And this advisory committee would look at phase 1 clinical trial data, and as I say, 1 or more phase 2. So very, very competent people looking at clinical trial data. Someone brewing up a treatment in their garage is not going to really get on the free-to-choose track. And free-to-choose medicine is a total system approach, and it's a market-based system. So if a drug is out there on the free-to-choose track, especially for a serious illness, and it demonstrates some real initial efficacy, more and more usage will take place and we'll get better data. If the drug has significant adverse side effects or simply is not effective, the usage would plummet. So it's this very fast-paced, market-based system which is so different from our current status quo system.
It will certainly be disruptive, and that's why don't expect big pharma, as far as I know. I mean, some of them claim to be neutral. They didn't even want this type of choice for those with terminal illness. And dozens and dozens of lobbyists. But there is no doubt if free-to-choose medicine was adopted, there would literally be hundreds, perhaps thousands of lobbyists that would no longer be necessary to lobby the FDA and to control that. And so, but what happened after Right to Try is Matt Bellina, I think just a few days later, or a few weeks later, one company announced they had the patent on the drug that he was trying to secure access to. And they announced that, yes, he would have access. They also announced a $300,000 price tag.
Yeah, exactly.
And then a few days later, after they announced they wouldn't provide it at any price. And so that to me is part of the problem with the Right to Try, where you don't have good incentives for companies to develop and you need a competitive model. It's not one at a time. We have a system which is trying to sort through thousands, tens of thousands of drugs at a time. And we're doing it expecting bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. to make the best decision. And but the thing about, don't forget drugs that are in phase 2 and phase 3, Americans are already receiving those drugs through trials. Are receiving them. And what we're talking about is taking drugs that are receiving them and providing an opportunity for patients and their doctors to find that access. And so Right to Try is trying to work through that. I think it's not enough incentives. Right now, as far as I know, there's not a single company that's stepped up to help. But you would think in today's social media world, it's going to happen. And drive that. So, but it's great to see Japan implementing that. But you mentioned charlatans. I just have to make a comment and a note. I just, right before it started here, it was noted, and folks in this room might have heard of something called Acthar gel. Have anybody heard about that before? It's something to deal with infantile spasms. The price of that gel in 2001 for a dose was $40. The price today is $38,892. It's been available for 68 years. What kind of system takes a gel that only costs $1 or whatever to make, and it's $40 if you goes and somehow buys up all the patents and charges $38,892. No one could defend that system. And so those charlatans, you say, you know, and that's usually the attack on those of reform. We're supposed to stop this kind of stuff. Well, that's what's occurring in the marketplace today. And the bureaucrats try to run here and here and figure all that. At the end of the day, let the marketplace dictate. The answer to that is everybody produce the gel that's needed. It's not even on patent anymore. And so they bought out the marketplace. So in this type of reform system, you would have market correction very quickly in these situations.
Before we go to you, sir, I actually have a question. To clarify something, maybe Bart can answer this question. Tim, you mentioned some people, Americans, are already getting these drugs through the trials. Isn't it the case that, I guess, half would get the drug and half wouldn't get the drug? Doesn't there have to be a control group, that there's people that they have hope because they're in a trial, but they're actually not getting the drug that they need? Is that always the case?
Yeah, but trials that have a placebo,
right,
then you may not get the treatment. So.
Yeah. So 50% of Americans are getting the drug, 50% are not.
There are not placebo trials
okay.
as well.
Sure.
But that to me is the ultimate insult, that the government says you can't have access, but then you think you do have access through a trial because you were just part of the trial. Think about that. All the great hope, and the folks on the other side of the table know, somebody knows it. No, you're just getting sugar water in this case. I mean, that's the ultimate insult if it is actually a solution.
Yeah.
One other point on incentives, that the current system puts a premium on skill in dealing with the FDA bureaucracy that very large pharmaceutical companies have. There are hundreds of small developmental companies that can have extraordinary scientific skill, but they don't have much capital and they don't have a skill in dealing with the FDA. Free to choose medicine changes everything. It puts a premium on scientific skill in developing breakthrough medicines. And that's what we want. So that when you analyze it from an economic perspective, it does a lot of good things. For example, everyone talks about breakthrough innovation. Radical out-of-the-box innovation. That's what we want for Alzheimer's, and right on down the list. Now, what happens is venture capitalists look at small developmental companies. And if you're a drug developer and you have some radical out-of-the-box type thinking, the venture capitalist says, what will the FDA demand for phase 3 clinical trial milestones? They're going to err on the side of safety. They will require extraordinarily severe testing requirements 8 to 10 years in the future. Good luck raising capital. Okay, now in the free to choose medicine world, the venture capitalist says, if this thing really works for serious illness, within 3 to 4 years, not 10 to 12, all we have to demonstrate is real live patients and not the FDA statistical milestones out there. It reduces the risk for innovation capital to flow to those companies that we really want the capital to get to.
Good point, sir.
Good. Thank you. Fascinating. I'm surprised something like Bill Gates wouldn't be behind something like this with all his money and his work on drugs. Anyhow, 2 quick questions, one out of ignorance. Aren't all the other countries' FDA equivalents, aren't they competition for the FDA? And
No.
Would they be included in this database too as well or not?
Well, the FDA kind of has its own world.
Well, I know, but I'm saying, but other companies, other countries approve drugs.
Well, what I would imagine, probably the first wave of drugs through are those that are already successful elsewhere and been approved in other countries. And so, to me, those are the quickest, fastest ones that we could pull in.
So they would be pulled in a database, right?
Not necessarily. It depends on what the law is. Right now, Senator Cruz and Senator Paul are going to have a hearing, we believe, in 2 months on reciprocity. I mean, what's the idea? You know, the best sunscreens in the world, they're not allowed in this country.
Yeah.
They've been allowed in Europe for 20 years. You know, and that makes no sense whatsoever. That's just one small thing, but there are literally thousands, and there are actually 2 million Americans walk with their feet right now, as far as we know, and leave this country for medical care.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's competition. And the more and more folks know about it, the more and more competition it is. But the FDA is very clear. They will punish companies that don't follow the rules here if they ever want to bring a drug back in that's been through trials elsewhere. There is a real punishment factor on that, and they know that. They toe that line. So they're willing to say, hey, we're going to work. We're the single largest pharmaceutical market in the world. The number two is Japan. And Japan's already doing actually exactly this, providing the type of competition. So I think the political stars line up to make it happen, but it's not going to be easy.
And then a real quick question is, this recent drug that Biogen had some very good success in Alzheimer's, would that be a candidate? I mean, because it's in phase 2, right? That's what I understand, right? That would be a candidate for...
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
And I'll say in the particular markets or the drugs that work the best is where there's some competition going on. And that's usually where pharmaceutical companies don't want to happen. And I get that. You know, but in Alzheimer's arena, we're actually seeing some breakthroughs on some unexpected areas tied to, and Mr. Madden knows this more than I do, tied to the herpes virus. And there's apparently might be some connection there. But again, this is what drove the Japanese reform, an aging society with South Korea maybe having a breakthrough on stem cell treatments. And it drove them to make these reforms that have been pushed for 10 years past by Heartland.
Sir, what is your name and where are you from?
Tom Sleater, Oak Brook, Illinois. Very fine presentation. I'd like to follow up on a point that Tim was hinting at. Is it possible that some drug companies are reluctant to push for this approach, even though they get revenues sooner because they'll antagonize the FDA bureaucracy?
I believe that is the case, and you'll hear it. They'll tell us that privately. We've had a couple of briefings, private briefings, and hearing from folks, experts say, "Well, that will really work," but the system doesn't want to change that. And what you see as far as the pharmaceutical world, Tom, is that you look at their returns on their investment. Most of the growth innovation has only been by buying up smaller companies, and they're starting to run out of those. And there have been not many breakthrough drugs recently. And but again, that's the system. So I say there's a problem at the FDA. Well, we also see a system in the industry that says, hey, it's going to take 15 years, get in line. And the invisible graveyard doesn't show up at the FDA. That's one of the things we're talking about. Maybe we'll put together a listing of all those who died waiting on drugs. But the Frank Burrows story is just tremendous. Every drug they wanted to get approved got approved 6, 12, 18, 24 months later, and people died, especially Abigail.
It's an excellent question. Some years ago, on a Friday night, I got a meeting with the CEO of a very, very large pharmaceutical company. And he says, this meeting is off the record. And I said, here's my case. I think you have a broken business model. Consumers hate you. You have sky-high drug prices. When you include the cost of failed drugs, it costs $2.5 billion to get an approved drug. And you have the risk sometime in the future, government can initiate price controls on the whole darn industry, and then your stock price will trade like a public utility stock price with downside risk. And he says, you're absolutely right. I said, you're going to support free-to-choose medicine? Well, no. He said, I have a lot of drugs right now waiting FDA approval. So don't expect me to stand up, okay? So realistically, I could see free-to-choose medicine getting started with smaller companies that are strapped for capital, and they have high scientific skill, and they simply want to demonstrate their drug works. Mm-hmm. And they're early in phase 2, and everyone knows they're onto something. And this also gets into how drug prices can drop. You get that. The ALS drug Tim mentioned, drug developers said $300,000 or what have you. Okay, what if we had on a free-to-choose track 6 or 7 or 8 companies developing in phase 2 early on an ALS drug? Now, they're motivated to keep the price down in order that more and more patients will take the drug, so they'll get better and better observational data and maybe get observational approval. So we would have a heightened competition among the biopharmaceutical industry in addition to competition for the FDA's process itself.
Okay. Thank you.
Sir, can you identify yourself and tell us where you're from?
Sure, Wayne Olson from New York. A similar question, I guess. You made reference to the incentive structure with respect to right to try. The patient has a right to acquire a medicine if he can find a pharmaceutical company willing to sell it to him. Do pharma companies avoid selling these pharmaceuticals because they fear adverse regulatory consequences? I mean, is that the incentive structure you're talking about?
Free-to-choose medicine has a lot of positive incentives with it that are missing from right to try. So currently, if I'm a drug developer, if I give a drug out, first of all, free-to-choose medicine is a market price for the drug. Now, with right to try, I couldn't charge a market price, but I'm giving it to terminally ill patients, many of whom are going to die. So if I'm a drug developer, I have to look over my shoulder and wonder, is the FDA going to demand even more extensive clinical trials because people are dying who are taking my drug? Now, hats off to the Goldwater Institute for coming up with right to try, because it has put freedom on the map. Monumental achievement. Now we get down into the practical details, and that's why transitioning to the free-to-choose medicine, I think, would be the way to go.
Right, we have time for one more question, sir.
Nope. I was just standing up. Dick Dyer, I live here in Las Vegas. Earlier this year, I joined an Alzheimer's trial. We have a Cleveland Clinic, Larry Rubo Brain Center here in Las Vegas. You may be aware of that. It's a 5-year trial, and they're trying to identify when Alzheimer's begins. There's no pharmaceutical product involved, but if having an insider connection to Cleveland Clinic will help you in any way, let me know. The doctor who was running the program has been a friend of mine for over 10 years, so he'll listen to me. And I did an interview on the ABC television station here a few months back to try to get people to join the trial, and the doctor that shared the interview with me had said there had been like 4,000 drugs for cancer in the last 10 years and one for Alzheimer's. He was pretty desperate. So anyways, I say I'd be glad to help if I can to get the message to them, and maybe there's another way to do a little lobbying.
And we've been working with a company that is trying to correct some of the, I think, market problems, market failures, and government failures in the trial portion of that. So they do note about 2% of Americans participate in trials, and the comparable rate in Great Britain is over 20%. And so we've got a problem here, and Mr. Bruce has some solutions on that internationally, what we can do. And so I think there are plenty of ways that, again, we're not talking to get thousands or tens of, we're talking about millions of Americans. And flip side on this for the drug companies, and Jennifer raises a great point. You know, there are 10,000 drugs that start in the lab that end up with one drug. So you winnow it down, 9,999. A system that does that more quickly and winnows down the drugs that are not working or don't work with certain bioindicators, even better for the system as well. I mean, we're talking about innovation. We're still stuck in 1961 methods. And Mr. Gottlieb, the commissioner, actually agrees with this as well. So this is very helpful. But if you check out our website at heartland.org, and actually launched a new website, Free to Choose Medicine. And
freetocchoosemedicine.com?
.us still.
.us
It'll be
still.
.com hopefully by tomorrow.
freetocchoosemedicine.us. Again, we're the Heartland Institute. If you want to know more about this subject, please visit our booth. Leave your name and your email address. We'll make sure that you're getting all the latest updates on this project and other things that we do in healthcare and that sort of thing. How about a round of applause for our two presenters today?